Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of the podcast has been alternating between an interview with a guest or multiple guests and a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship. In this week's particular episode, I am unpacking the paper titled Diversity Barriers in K-12 Computer Science Education, Structural and Social. Now, this paper was written by Jennifer Wang and Moghadam. Apologies if I mispronounce names. Here's the abstract for this particular paper. Quote, as computer science, CS, education expands at the K-12 level, we must be careful to ensure that CS neither exacerbates existing equity gaps in education nor hinders efforts to diversify the field of CS. In this paper, we discuss structural and social barriers that influence Blacks, Hispanics, and girls, based on surveys of 1,672 students, 1,677 parents, 1,008 teachers, 9,805 principals, and 2,307 superintendents in the United States. We find that despite high interest in CS among Black and Hispanic students and parents, these students experience greater structural barriers in accessing computers and CS classes than white students. And while girls have the same access as boys, social barriers exist, with girls reporting lower awareness of CS opportunities outside of classes, less encouragement from teachers and parents, and less exposure to CS role models in the media. It is critical for expanding CS opportunities to address the unique issues for each group, end quote. As always, you can find a direct link to this paper in the show notes, and if you click on the author last names, it'll take you to their Google Scholar profile, where you can read more publications that they have written. To find those, you can go to jaredoleary.com and click on the podcast tab, or simply clicking the link in the description on the app that you're listening to this on. Alright, so in the introduction and relevance section of this paper, the authors are describing how CS is a relatively new subject area in K-12 education, and I would add especially in the elementary areas. And because it is not required for every student to take this class, it can create some gaps in terms of who ends up taking it or who knows they can take this kind of course, and why. So for example, the authors mentions, quote, Blacks and Hispanics make up 13.3% and 17.6% of the US population, end quote. That's from page 615. However, when we look at the AP Computer Science A tests in 2015, we see that, quote, only 3.9% were Black and 9.2% were Hispanic, end quote. And they also included lower pass rates within those groups. The authors also mention that among women, there's been a drop in enrollment numbers in university courses for computer science. So for example, in 1984, 37% of CS degree earners were women, but at the time of this publication, only 18% of women were CS degree earners. In addition, going back to the AP test results, only 21.9% of students were women. Now, the authors note that there are many social influences that can inform whether somebody wants to go into it. So for example, parents may encourage some students to go into a field or area of study, or end up discouraging them. In addition, teachers can also do that, or even just general social perceptions. So for example, how people are portrayed in media can have an influence on it. So as I've talked about in previous podcasts, if only white or Asian males are portrayed as computer scientists, then people might look at those examples of media and say, oh, well, I don't see myself in there because I don't identify as a white or Asian male. So, quote, the purpose of this study was to better understand the existing context and barriers in order to inform efforts to broaden participation, end quote. Okay, so that quote was from page 616. So the methods section of this particular paper highlights how they obtained all the data for this. So there's a variety of data sources. As I mentioned in the abstract, they interviewed a bunch of students, parents, teachers, principals, and superintendents. These interviews were about 10 minutes in length over the phone. But then specifically with the principals and the superintendents, they had web-based survey that were filled out. All of the results were weighted to kind of account for different things. For example, matching age, gender, education, race, ethnicity, etc., depending on location in the United States. So this is supposed to give a sampling of information or perspectives from across the United States, specifically around the structural and social barriers or diversity. All right, so here is the very first paragraph on the results section. This is from page 617. Quote, we found that the structural barriers in access and exposure to CS and technology were varied for Blacks, Hispanics, and whites. while social barriers of perceptions and encouragement were not seen to be differentiating factors by race or ethnicity. On the other hand, social barriers seemed to be stronger for girls, while structural barriers did not differ significantly by gender. End quote. All right, so I gotta admit, while reading through this results section, I highlighted pretty much the entire section. So I'm gonna do my best to not repeat back everything, because I do recommend that you actually go and read this paper, and I'm going to kind of highlight some of the results that really stood out or were of particular interest to me. It might be helpful to you and your classroom or the kids that you work with. So when it came to interest in computer science, it was interesting that they found that 31% of Black and 35% of Hispanic students indicated that they were interested in learning computer science. However, only 21% of white students indicated they were interested in learning computer science. That is fascinating, because as I mentioned, media tends to portray white or Asian males as being a computer scientist. Now, when it comes to gender, specifically along the binary of male and female, the authors did not include non-binary or trans individuals. They found that 34% of boys were interested in learning computer science. However, only 16% of girls were interested in learning computer science. And if we look at the negative answer to that, so students who were not at all interested in learning computer science, they found that 24% of girls were not at all interested in learning computer science, and 13% of boys were not at all interested in learning computer science. Now, that is also fascinating. In particular, I'm curious to know why is it that these were the results. Now, the authors provide some suggestions, but I have some my own lingering questions or thoughts that I'll share towards the end. All right, now when it came to race or ethnicity, the authors found that white individuals were more likely to have an adult in their life who works with computers, were more likely to use computers at school, and were more likely to use computers at home than Blacks and Hispanics. Now, on some of these, the percentages were relatively minor. So, for example, like 68% of white students versus 65% of Black students for having an adult at home. But then others, there were more drastic of a difference in that. So, for example, in that same question, only 49% of Hispanics felt that there was an adult in their life who worked with computers or different types of technology. Now, the authors note that, quote, less computer use corresponded with lower confidence in CS, end quote. It's from page 617, which makes sense. The more you are able to use your computer, the more experience you're able to have with it, the more likely, my guess is, that you'd be able to develop confidence in using that thing. If you do something infrequently, odds are you're not going to be as confident with it as if you do something frequently. So if you cook a meal once a month, you're probably not going to be as confident as somebody who cooks a meal every single night. And if you don't know how to cook a meal, I highly recommend learning, because it saves you money and it could be healthier. Now, in addition to having access to adults or to devices and how that corresponds with confidence, the authors also looked at having access to classes and how that kind of impacted an interest in wanting to learn computer science. And they basically found that the more access there were to classes, the more likely students were interested in learning computer science. However, they did find that, quote, Black students are less likely than white or Hispanic students to have access, end quote, from page 618. So even though, as I mentioned earlier, they might be more interested in doing computer science, the results from this particular survey found that they are less likely to have access to be able to do computer science. Now, one kind of random question that I have about that is, I wonder if by having more opportunities for computer science, if students realize, you know what, it's not for me. I'm not interested in computer science as a field. But I don't know, because that wasn't the purpose of this particular survey. So the authors also asked a question about how people learn computer science. So for example, did you learn it in a class at school, on your own, online, in a group or club, or in a formal group outside of school? Now what's interesting is most of the respondents said that they learned it in school. So there's about a 2% spread between each of the three racial or ethnic demographics. There's also about a 5% spread on whether or not a student learned it on their own. There's about a 1% spread for students learning online. But then when we get to the in-group or club, or learning it in an informal group outside of school, there's a huge spread on this. So in the group or the club, 18% of white students learned in a group or club, 34% of Black students learned in a group or club, and 41% of Hispanics learned in a group or a club. So that was a 23-point spread across the percentages on that one. Now, the formal group outside of school, 17% of white students learned it, 38% of Black students learned within a formal group, and then 21% of Hispanic students learned in a formal group outside of school. So that is a 25-point difference in the percentages on that particular answer. So that is interesting. And here's a quote on this from page 618. Quote, "It is important to note that Black and Hispanic students who have learned CS are still twice as likely to have learned it in a class at school as through these out-of-school means. We see that Black and Hispanic students are more likely than white students to participate in out-of-school programs." End quote. That's really interesting, and I'm really curious, well, why is that? So if anyone is a researcher and is listening to this, and is also interested in that, I'd be curious to know. Or if anyone can point to some more research that I could unpack in a future episode, I'd be happy to do that. Okay, so here's another quote from page 618. A couple sentences long, but it's really interesting. Quote, "Black and Hispanic students were more likely than white students to report a parent has told them they would be good at CS. 40% of Black and 41% of Hispanic students compared to 35% of white students. This corroborates other data that show that Black and Hispanic parents are more likely than white parents to want their children to learn CS. 91% of Black and Hispanic parents versus 85% of white parents. And to believe their child will learn CS. 35% of Black and 53% of Hispanic versus 24% of white parents. In contrast to Black students, we do see lower confidence in learning CS among Hispanic students. 51% of Hispanic students versus 68% of Black, and 56% of white students are very confident." End quote. So that's really interesting. I'm curious why it is that Black and Hispanic parents are more likely to encourage students to go into it. I wonder if it has to do with money and the idea of job access, because there's all these unmet jobs, but that's just a guess. I have no idea, as this is a survey of lots of people. All right, so here's kind of a summary from page 618. Quote, "While Black and Hispanic students have less access to computers at home and in school, they and their parents report more interest in learning CS. Hispanic students do not have less access to CS classes, but they are less likely to know an adult working in technology and less likely to be confident in learning CS. And Black students do not report less encouragement, less often seeing people in the media like themselves engage in CS, or less confidence. Yet both of these groups are underrepresented among AP CS participants, CS bachelor's degree earners, and the CS workforce." End quote. Really interesting findings, and I'm curious why it is that, although they're more interested in it, they're less likely to get a degree or take AP classes. So the question would be, why? Okay, so the next section of the results section is specifically talking about gender. Again, so the authors only talk about male and female. They do not talk about non-binary or trans individuals, but I will talk a little bit about that later. And the authors found that, quote, "Besides the mandatory participation in classes, girls are less likely to be aware of optional learning opportunities when it comes to CS." End quote. It's from page 619. Here's another quote from the same page. Quote, "When looking at students who have learned CS, again, there is no difference by gender for the most commonly reported way of learning CS through a class in school. However, boys are more likely than girls to have learned CS in other opportunities outside of a class. Again, this confirms that when the opportunity is not necessarily part of a regular or required component, girls are less likely to participate. This also means that boys are spending more of their own free time learning CS, possibly contributing to preparatory privilege as they become more experienced and knowledgeable than other students." End quote. Now, interestingly, the amount of encouragement that boys received versus what girls received was pretty drastically different. So, for example, 44% of boys were told by teachers that they would be good at CS, whereas only 12% of girls were told that they would be good at CS by a teacher. A similar spread was found among parents. So 43% of boys were told by a parent that they'd be good at computer science, but only 17% of girls were told they would be good at computer science by a parent. Now, the authors also asked questions about gender representation in media, and they found that only 11% of girls felt that they were represented in computer scientists within media, but 21% of boys felt that they were represented in computer scientists that are portrayed via media. And then if we go to the extreme end of it, where they were never likely to see someone who looked like themselves, 31% of girls said that they never saw themselves in computer scientists in media, and only 18% of boys said that they never saw themselves in computer scientists portrayed in media. So those are pretty stark differences. So here's a final quote from page 619. Quote, With gender, we saw that girls have lower confidence in their ability to learn CS, report less interest in learning CS, and are less likely to have learned CS compared to boys. Furthermore, we found that students who are more interested in learning CS are also more likely to believe they will have a job using CS, with boys more likely to believe so. For girls, access may not be the challenge. Instead, the belief that girls are less likely to be interested in CS may result in them receiving less encouragement from parents and teachers, which in turn exacerbates girls' beliefs that they do not belong in CS, end quote. All right, so that concludes the main findings of this particular study. However, there was a bunch more that I ended up not talking about because I would have basically read the entire thing out loud to you. So I highly recommend actually going and reading this paper, which again, I link to in the show notes. All right, as always, in these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I like to talk about some lingering questions or thoughts, just thinking out loud and not critiquing the authors in any way, because I really enjoyed their paper. So the first question that I have is, if everyone within a demographic category participates in CS as part of a mandatory class, but only a subset of the demographic chooses to further their learning outside of the class, why is that? So for example, if boys, girls, non-binary, and trans individuals are all required to take a class, but only, let's say, the non-binary and trans individuals decide that they want to continue to learn computer science outside of class, why would that be? What about for the students who chose not to continue their learning outside of class? Is it because the subject area in general is considered to be boring to them? Does it have to do with how it was taught, or how the curriculum was used, or what was in the curriculum? And I actually do unpack some papers that talk about that a little bit more, so I'll link to those in the show notes. Now I ask this because it's important to look at the differences among demographic information, or at least it can be. But what's really important is once we find differences, we need to ask the follow-up question of why. Why is that? Why is it that some people are really interested in this subject area or approach or curriculum or whatever, and other people less so? So another question that I have is, if non-binary individuals were also included in this survey, how would the results potentially change the rationales for the findings? So in particular, the idea that because people don't see themselves in media, they can't imagine themselves doing computer science. What does that mean for trans individuals, who are often excluded from media or discourse entirely? So for example, they weren't mentioned in this paper. Do trans or non-binary individuals tend to fall within the results of the sex that was assigned at birth? Do they tend to group with the perspectives of the gender they most identify with? Or is it something completely different? And as a non-binary individual, I'm genuinely curious about this, and I really wish more researchers would actually include perspectives outside the gender binary. So if we could do a follow-up study similar to this one, please include non-binary and trans individuals. And the last question that I have is, what other ways might we address demographic imbalances in CS education and CS as a field? So for example, in addition to continuing to elevate the voices of marginalized individuals and groups, what if we also challenge the assumption that you have to see yourself represented within a career before you can believe you can do that career? Or instead of thinking about it in career, just think of it as a hobby or a leisure pursuit. So for example, my parents said that I could be anything if I put my mind to it. But it doesn't sound like that's what many of the survey respondents believe. And it's likely a result because they weren't really encouraged that they could do anything, like computer science. So again, representation is very important. I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on that. I'm just thinking out loud, what if we also encouraged a growth mindset and encourage kids to pursue their interests regardless of if they see other people like them doing what they're interested in? So if we could couple that approach with approach of elevating more voices, having more representation, how might that be able to impact demographic imbalances? And again, this is just me thinking out loud. If there is research on that, I would love to read it. So please let me know by pressing the contact me button on my website. All right, so those are just kind of my lingering thoughts and questions for this particular paper. Again, I really enjoyed it. I don't know if they've done a follow-up study on this, as this was published in 2017, but I highly recommend everybody checking it out, which again, you can find at jaredoleary.com or clicking the link in the show notes for the app that you're listening to this on. Thank you so much for listening to this particular episode. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing with somebody else, and stay tuned next week for an interview. Hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.